In the second here, I'm going to introduce Scott David and Erin Wing, who are our amazing presenters today. And then Erin's going to present first, and then Scott's going to present after that. And then we'll have some time for Q&A. So let me tell you a little bit about Erin and Scott before they start. Excuse me. Erin Wing is the Deputy Director of Investigations for Animal Outlook and a former undercover investigator. Over the course of 2 years, she went on to complete 4 investigations in the dairy, chicken, and aquaculture industries, including the first ever undercover expose of salmon aquaculture in the US. After an intense last investigation at a dairy factory farm in Southern California, she retired from the field. Erin's investigations have helped shed light on the suffering animals endure on factory farms in the animal agriculture system. Her work has been featured in the Washington Post, The Guardian, and the New York Times. And Scott David is the current Director of Investigations for Animal Outlook and a former undercover investigator as well. His investigative work has offered the first hidden camera look inside a U.S. lamb slaughterhouse and at a Hormel supplier slaughter plant, exposed the horrors of a cruel USDA high-speed slaughter pilot program that could be expanded to facilities nationwide. Scott's investigative video from inside a Mountaire Farms chicken slaughterhouse in North Carolina exposing shocking animal abuse was filmed as a dangerous ag gag law made its way through the state legislature, revealing the dangers of this type of legislation aimed at preventing investigations and whistleblowing. His footage has shed light on the plight of animals in slaughterhouses across the country, resulting in media headlines from the New York Times, Washington Post, Associated Press, CNN, and more in the US and internationally. So with that, we were just talking about, it's funny to describe being excited about this presentation because we're going to talk about something that's really upsetting, but we were just talking about how it's just the undercover investigations are so incredibly important and impactful. And what's exciting is being able to shed light and, on a hidden subject and bring the truth out into the open. So very grateful to Erin and Scott for both being here today. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Erin.
Thanks, Tracy. Really glad to be here and to be able to share my presentation with you all. I hope it will be very informative, if not something that might be difficult to take in and process. But again, this is what I'll be covering is something that is a reality for a lot of chickens in the animal agriculture system. So I'm going to share my screen and okay, so hopefully all of you can see this. So as Tracy mentioned, I am Deputy Director of Investigations at Animal Outlook, and I was also an undercover investigator for 2 years. And one of the investigations that I was able to conduct over the course of my career was into a chicken farm facility. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about that, and also a couple of other investigations that Animal Outlook has done into the chicken industry at large. And going along the lines of what Tracy mentioned earlier in terms of giving these animals names or being able to establish that they could have names and that they are individual beings, I'm going to take you all through the journey of one specific chick, and her name is Beth. And this will be baby Beth's journey through the dark world of chicken farming. So not only will we be covering her journey, but also one that many chicks have to go through in the chicken industry. So we start off with Beth's first days of life. Beth is born into a cold world of machinery, callousness, and misery. Beth is part of the production cycle in a hatchery where chickens who will be raised in what the animal agriculture world calls the broiler chicken industry, that's where they're born. This facility is a fast-paced, dangerous place where workers have little to no regard for the care and safety of the newborn chicks they sort through. Beth, along with hundreds of other chicks, are jostled on conveyor belts, transferred through dangerous machinery that can cause horrific injuries if chicks are caught in the equipment, and they can have their limbs or skin ripped from their bodies in the process. Injured, weak, and sick birds who are deemed as worthless or undesirable by the industry are tossed aside by employees with no thought for how fragile and helpless these tiny birds are. In one of our investigations into a hatchery facility, we documented a newly hatched chick who was left to drown in a trash bucket filled with thick and bloody water. Chicks workers single out as not having the ability to live long enough to grow to market weight will be thrown into trays and piles and left to suffer, possibly for hours. They receive no medical treatment as they are ultimately destined for the macerator. A macerator is a machine with spinning blades in it, and chicks who are separated and categorized as disposable by the hatchery will be dumped into the machine where the spinning blades will grind them up alive. Beth may avoid being thrown into the macerator, but many chicks aren't able to avoid such a fate. So here in Beth's first days of life, she might encounter injuries, illness, neglect, and there's also the case of chicks being thrown into a macerator to be grinded up alive. And essentially, baby birds are just cogs in the wheels of the animal agriculture industry. So although Beth survives for now, she's still filtered through the rough mechanical process in the hatchery until she is finally placed on a truck to be sent out to a chicken meat farm, where chickens raised for their meat in the animal agriculture system are grown to market weight. In the world of animal agriculture, there is never any guarantee that the animals will survive or go unharmed. There's only a fixation of profit and production. Billions of chicks are hatched with little regard for their safety or well-being. The only concern is that they live long enough to be slaughtered for their bodies and their flesh. This is the world that baby Beth is born into, and her short time in the hatchery is just the beginning. So when baby Beth is taken along with thousands of other chicks, piled into trays and packed onto trucks, the detached, fast-paced nature of the industry extends to this new place that they are taken to as well. Chicks are unloaded into one of many empty, windowless sheds on the chicken farm site, roughly tossed out of trays and onto the ground by workers. Many chicks are injured in the process. Life at the facility will become a daily fight for young Beth. In dark sheds without any enrichment, just dirt floors and feed and water areas, she will fight to ward off illness and injury. Many other chicks who are too small, not growing fast enough, or deformed will be picked out by workers, chased down, and killed in brutal ways on a daily basis. During my time working undercover at a farm contracted to Tyson at the time, it was standard procedure to walk through the many sheds and for workers to kill chicks who were undesirable for the industry. During my investigation, I documented workers taking chicks and bashing their heads against pipes to kill them. I also documented workers using crude weapons to chase down the chicks who ran for their lives. With plastic pipes that had nails driven into the ends of them, workers would strike the chicks, impaling them on the nails in some cases. Some chicks were hit with metal grabber tools as well, and each of these methods would not kill the baby birds instantly. In our investigation video, chicks can be seen writhing on the ground in agony after being struck. In other cases, when chicks survived being hit by the workers, they were still thrown into tractor buckets, alive amongst piles of the corpses of other chicks. And in our investigation video, you can even see one of these chicks in that pile in a tractor bucket, crying out amongst the dead bodies. Beth will struggle through this nightmare without knowing if she will ever see an end to it. Sadly, that nightmare goes on for longer than she could ever imagine. Chickens raised for meat on farms endure a number of miseries as they spend day in, day out in dark sheds. Thousands of chickens are packed into these sheds with no sunlight, no enrichment, with feces and urine soaked into the ground they walk on. I remember during my investigation, anytime I set foot in the sheds, the ammonia fumes were so strong, the air would sting my eyes, and just breathing in would cause my breathing to be raspy for hours afterward. Here I am 4 years later, and I was recently diagnosed with asthma. And that's something that probably wouldn't have happened unless I had spent time at that facility. And if that happened to me after just several weeks there, imagine what it's like for the chickens who don't get to leave these facilities. Not only do they suffer from these filthy conditions, Animal Outlook has also documented the tragic cruelty that exists on these chicken meat farms. In an investigation we conducted in 2014, workers were seen throwing chickens across sheds, with live chickens being thrown into walls. Live chickens were also dumped into pits along with dead chickens as if they were trash and not living sentient beings. They were buried alive under piles of dead bodies. The chickens who die, their bodies amongst the living, have to be picked up by workers. Now, due to overcrowding, workers might not see all the dead bodies, and those corpses that are left behind decompose for days until they practically turn into this liquid that smells disgusting. And I remember on many occasions, actually, when I was conducting my investigation at a chicken farm and I had to pick up these dead bodies that were left behind, they would just fall right through my hands. That was how decomposed they were and how long that they had been left in those sheds. Sadly, these horrific conditions and practices extend even beyond just chicken meat farms and is pervasive throughout the chicken industry. In another investigation that we conducted on multiple chicken breeding farms, known as broiler breeding farms, an investigator documented the inhumane killing of birds, including a supervisor suffocating animals by standing on their heads, along with other workers who would punch some of these chickens. We also uncovered the brutal and unnecessary practice of nose boning, in which workers grabbed young male breeder birds by their heads and stabbed a dull plastic rod through their sensitive nostrils to limit their food intake. After viewing our Undercover video, Tyson Foods, the corporation the farms were contracted to, did immediately end the cruel practice of nose boning, but many issues still persist in the industry. For Beth in particular, her time on a chicken meat farm will be filled with seemingly endless misery. For approximately 47 days, her body will grow exponentially, more than her small frame will be able to handle, due to her breed being genetically modified for rapid growth. The unnaturally large amount of weight that she develops in such a short amount of time may cause her to develop leg injuries, much like other chickens do, affecting their ability to access food and water. During my chicken farm investigation, I documented chickens who also suffered from various deformities, such as fractured beaks and necks twisted to the point that their necks were almost folded over. I also documented one chicken who walked around in one shed with a massive growth hanging from their chest. Another danger that exists for chickens like Beth is sudden death syndrome, which occurs in rapidly young chickens raised for meat, and some chickens may have sudden heart attacks. It's also called flip-over disease. In many chicken farms, dilapidated equipment also poses a serious risk to the safety and health of the chickens being kept there. With the risk of rusted water pipes breaking and causing flooding in the sheds where the birds are packed in by the thousands, resulting in some chickens being drenched in water. There's also a risk of insulating equipment in the sheds breaking, which could leave chickens who have never grown accustomed to the outdoors exposed to the elements. Many farmers or supporters of the industry will claim that farmed animals live carefree lives and have one bad day when their lives are taken from them. But these animals clearly don't have just one bad day. They suffer for days, weeks, every single day they are in captivity, treated like objects, tormented and abused until their last moments. They never know compassion, they never know kindness, they will never feel a gentle touch or be seen as anything more than products by their captors. This is the horrific existence that Beth is forced to live. And unfortunately, her journey is far from over. And Scott will be able to pick up her story from where I've left off here. And it just does not get any much better from here, unfortunately. And
sorry, yeah, I'll be sharing my screen in a second. Let's see. Okay, hopefully that worked. Good. Can see something theoretically. All right, cool. All right. Like Erin said, I'm going to be continuing Beth's story. So a little bit about me, I guess, to start off, or like the reason why I'm here is I'm the director of investigations for Animal Outlook, and I was formerly an undercover investigator, also with Animal Outlook back when we had a different name. But the reason that I am talking here about chickens specifically is that the first investigation I ever did while I was in the field, out of the 3 that I ended up completing, was an investigation into a chicken slaughterhouse. So it was a slaughterhouse called Mountaire Farms. It was in 2015. And yeah, I'm going to be telling you all about that, as well as the journey that chickens like Beth go through, sort of at the last stages of their life in the factory farming system. So where Erin sort of left off was talking about how these chickens grow up in factory farming and all sorts of different problems that they face, including the injuries and illnesses that you could potentially see in these factory farm birds. Right? And she also mentioned that these birds are on these farms or stay on these farms for a period of about 6 weeks approximately. So when birds reach this age of 6 weeks, they weigh approximately 3 to 5 pounds. And when birds like Beth reach that weight, that is what is called known as their slaughter weight, right? And that's when they're sent off to slaughterhouses to be killed for their meat. And I think that when a lot of people talk about the plight of these animals, whether it's chickens or any other sort of factory farmed animal, right? Whether it's pigs, cows, any sort of animal, they're always sort of quick to point out that these animals really are babies, right? I mean, these animals aren't living like full, long lives or anything like that. They are being killed when they're very, very young. And this is especially true of chickens, right? Chickens naturally can live somewhere between like 5 to 10 years, maybe even more. But the chickens like Beth, who are raised as broiler birds, will be sent off to slaughter at really just 6 weeks of age. So these birds are incredibly young when they're slaughtered. So when they are at that age, 6 weeks, and are ready to be sent off to slaughter, what has to happen, of course, is that the birds have to be prepped for transport. So this picture that you see on the screen right now is from a Tyson investigation. I believe that is the one actually conducted by Erin. So if you have any questions later on during the Q&A section, feel free to address to Erin if you have something specific you want to know about this. But when chickens are going to be sent off to slaughter, what has to happen is a lot of times a catch crew will have to come in to the farm to take all the birds out, right? And these birds, these sheds that house them can house 20,000 or more individual animals within each shed. But the catch crew will come in, they'll have some machinery, maybe like a forklift, that will come in to bring these cages that you see in the middle of that picture there. And the catch crew will then proceed to gather up the chickens. For the most part, they'll grab the chickens by their legs, but they'll grab multiple birds at a time, and then they'll basically just throw them into the cages, right? And a catch crew can get through an entire shed, right, of tens of thousands of birds in really just like a couple of hours. They're working incredibly fast. They're picking up multiple birds at a time, and you don't see this sort of like caring placement of the birds one by one into these cages. The birds really are just like thrown into these compartments without much care for their health or safety. And also because of the forklifts that are coming in and out of these sheds to bring cages in and out, you also get situations where birds can actually be run over by these forklifts. And we do have footage of that happening, again, during Erin's Tyson investigation. So these birds can be grievously injured during this process. Obviously, being run over by a forklift is enough to kill birds, but birds can be hurt based on like the handling of the people. They can be injured by the cages themselves. Obviously, they're packed really tight in there, so they can be injured by other birds. It's definitely a sort of dangerous situation for them while they're being caught and being sent off, preparing to be sent off to slaughter. But that's sort of the catching process, roughly. And once catching happens, and the cages are all filled up, the sheds have been cleaned out of birds, then of course, birds like Beth have to be actually taken to the slaughterhouse. So the cages you can see here are stacked on top of a truck. So there's, I think, like 2 stories of cages on there. And this picture is actually from Mountaire Farms, where I did my undercover investigation into chicken slaughter. And this is at the point where Chuck was just arriving at the facility, right? Nothing had been done to this truck after it arrived at the facility. It's just getting there. And as you can see, these birds are basically completely exposed. They don't have any like sort of covering on them. So they're very much just exposed to the weather or anything else during the transport process. So if it's hot outside, right, there's no sort of like cooling system available for these animals. They just have to feel all of that, thermal stress And there's also like no food or water provided to these animals as they're being transported. So you can see they arrive in these like huge loads like this to the slaughterhouses. And at the slaughterhouses, well, this is where I think the brunt of my knowledge begins. We actually do have a number of slaughterhouse investigations that we've done here at Animal Outlook. We have one way back in 2004 at a Purdue slaughterhouse. We have the one that I accomplished right at Mount Terre Farms in 2015. And then the latest one we did was at Amick Farms in Maryland in 2018. And this is a picture from Amick Farms, actually, that you see on screen at a job called Live Hang, which I will talk pretty in depth about later, since I do have some experience in that arena. But once the birds arrive at the slaughterhouse, right, they still have to be unloaded from these trucks. So you can see in this picture, which was also taken at Amick, the cages then go onto, they're taken by forklift onto a sort of like conveyor belt system. They're lined up like that. And what essentially happens is when they reach the end of that line, the cages with the birds inside them will basically be tipped over onto the cage's side and be shaken, right? Which is supposed to dislodge the birds, and the birds will fall out of those cages onto a conveyor belt down below. And of course, if you shake the cage too fast, or a lot of the birds fall out at once, you end up with birds being piled up on top of each other on this conveyor belt. And the birds on that conveyor belt will end up being taken into the live hang room. And I know I talked about birds being taken into something called live hang, but it is worth saying that a lot of birds do not, in fact, arrive alive at the slaughterhouse, right? A lot of birds will arrive dead due to really any sort of number of reasons, right? They could be injured during transport. You can see that one of these birds on the left side of my screen has been caught in the wiring of one of the cages on a truck and has died there. And you can also see on the right side of my screen, that is a still from Mount Terre Farms. It's a bit hard to see for reasons that I'll explain later, but that is a number of chickens who have died during transport and whose bodies have just been discarded in the live hang room. And you can see that there's basically enough birds to form a few like small piles up in there. So a lot of birds, for a lot of birds, their story, well, will end even before they reach the slaughterhouse, essentially. If Beth is lucky, she'll end up, well, I don't want to say lucky. If Beth survives the transport, she will end up in live hang. So live hang is probably one of the more like horrific jobs that I've had to see in my time as an undercover investigator. So what happens in live hang is that the birds, like I said, will come down on a conveyor belt, right, from being dumped out of the cages. And the conveyor belt will run right through the live hang room. And on the sides of that conveyor belt, you'll have workers standing shoulder to shoulder with each other. And above the conveyor belt, sort of eye level with the workers, then you'll get these shackles that are coming by overhead. And the shackles will have sort of like two places in them where you can wedge the legs of these chickens. So the job of the workers, basically the only job of these workers, something that they do for 8 or more hours a day, is to basically thrust their hands into what is potentially like a writhing mass of birds who have been dumped out on a conveyor belt and try to find a leg of a bird, ideally, and pull the bird from that mass, grab the other leg, and then sort of hold the bird like this and shackle those legs or wedge those legs into the shackles. And that is basically the only thing that those workers do. So here I'll also talk a little bit about the plight of the workers as well as the plight of birds like Beth, because honestly, these sorts of systems are horrible for pretty much everyone involved, right? In live hang, the thing that is, I think, most striking, the thing that's striking about a lot of jobs, especially in slaughterhouses, is the speed that people have to perform at, right? In Mountaire Farms, we were required to shackle 24 birds per minute, which is roughly one bird every couple seconds. And if you've ever handled animals before, right? If you have animals like home, companion animals, stuff like that, you know that 2 seconds per animal, trying to pick an animal up, right, and place that animal somewhere, that is nowhere near enough time, and it is completely outside of what could be considered any sort of humane handling. So not only do the workers have to shackle these birds at a rate of 24 birds per minute, but while they are doing so, they also have to look through the birds that they pick up and determine which are dead and which are alive. Because again, many of these birds did not survive their trip to the slaughterhouse. So when the workers run into a bird who is dead, they'll throw the carcass down to the ground. As you saw in that previous picture, they sort of pile up there like that. But because of the speed these workers work at, there's not a lot of time to accurately determine which birds are alive and which are dead. Some of the birds that the workers might identify as dead are actually just maybe weak from their journey, but they'll also be tossed to the ground, discarded, and they could end up in these piles and have dead animals or other weak animals piled on top of them like that. The live hang room is it's a really interesting room, really. I mean, it's kept dark on purpose in a lot of different places. It sort of depends on the slaughterhouse. In Mountaire, it's kept really dark with only sort of red lights to light it. And that was supposed to be a ploy to keep the chickens more calm than they otherwise might be during the live hang process. But I can definitely attest that this tactic didn't work perfectly. These birds were definitely, a lot of them were definitely struggling, doing anything they could to really sort of get away from workers, right? They would flap their wings, they'd be vocalizing, they would be defecating when they were being held. I mean, they would try and get away on foot sometimes, but as Erin stated before, there were a lot of leg injuries as these birds grow up, so a lot of them aren't too fast while moving like that. But because of all of this movement, because these birds are struggling so hard to get away from the workers, it also creates a very disgusting environment where there's a ton of feathers and feces and blood even, which is just flying around the workers completely. And it's well known to the workers that this is happening. I mean, the workers are covered up almost completely. We wore coveralls, we wore hard hats, hairnets, goggles, masks, gloves, big rubber boots. People would go into the break rooms before work and during breaks, get paper towels and use them to sort of wrap up any sort of opening in their clothing that they could find, because they knew that all of these sort of sources of matter were flying around. I remember I used to get a lot of feces that would sort of slip underneath my goggles and almost get into my eyes. And at work or after work, I would go home and just jump in the shower with all my clothes on and just sort of watch all of these feathers and feces collect in the drain. And that was, after taking off all of my equipment. So it's just the things that had seeped in like that. So it's definitely a horrible process for the workers as well. But of course, the chickens like Beth are, definitely suffering the most and are nearing the end of their journey in the slaughterhouse by the time that live hang happens. And of course, during the live hang process, we also do see a lot of rough handling for these birds. So a lot of the workers, they were guilty of things like throwing the animals. You can see in this picture, this is a picture from Mount Hare Farms, the slaughterhouse that I investigated. You can see that it's kind of hard to pick out what's happening, but you can see that it's a reddish tint. That's from what I was talking about earlier with the rooms being kept purposely dark and only lit by red lights. But this worker on the left side of that picture, he has a chicken in his right hand. And what he is doing is essentially pitching that bird like a baseball, trying to get that bird into a shackle, right? And he's doing that really just because he wants to, right? It's not the proper way or the way that we were taught, at least, to shackle these animals. But it's something that was done very often by these workers, especially the ones in the sort of like front of the line. And I could tell that they were well practiced in it, not just because I saw them do it often, but because a lot of the times they would actually be able to get these chickens in the shackles by throwing them like that. But of course, these people weren't pitching perfect games or anything. So a lot of times the birds would hit the shackles, these metal shackles, bounce off, and then land on either the conveyor belt or the floor. A lot of people were also guilty of hitting a lot of the birds. They punched birds while they were in the shackles, almost like they were trying to hit speed bags or something like that. Sometimes when the line would stop, people would start plucking the feathers of the birds. We documented at least one person plucking the feathers of the birds and then throwing these feathers at other workers. There was also one employee that I documented who, during a line breakdown, would actually force the mouth of one bird open to stick his finger down the bird's throat. So there's definitely a lot of rough handling on the part of the workers, and a lot of rough handling that also just comes from the speed that these workers have to perform at, right? I talked about how you have to shackle one bird every couple seconds, which isn't a lot of time to get the sort of ideal hand placement of being able to grab a leg of a bird. So a lot of people would just start grabbing whatever they could, right? Wings or heads, and then pulling birds, out from under a pile of birds on the conveyor belt by their wings or heads. And then because the birds are struggling during this portion while being shackled, sometimes it wasn't the bird's legs that would be caught in the shackles, their heads would be caught instead. And then, someone would have to basically like try and hit a bird's head up so the bird's head became unwedged. So definitely a lot of cruelty and a lot of just rough handling that happens to these birds at this portion. So from the live hang room, these birds are shackled upside down like this, and then they will start to go through the rest of the process leading up to slaughter. So first, they'll go through an electrified water bath. So this is a bath that is supposed to shock the animals, rendering them insensible. So remember, these birds are hanging upside down. So essentially, these birds will go through with just their heads and be shocked like that. And at Hammock Farms, which is the latest investigation that we've done into chicken slaughter, there were actually a few line breakdowns that we were able to document where birds had their heads stuck under the water for minutes at a time. Birds that were going through the electrified water bath when the line broke down, and then just no one bothered to rescue these birds, essentially. But for when the line is working normally, the birds will go through that electrified water bath, hopefully become stunned, and then from there, you can see in this picture. I mean, it's hard to see in this picture, But what is happening is that the birds' throats are going over a spinning blade, which is what cuts their throats and kills them. But of course, because not all chickens are the same, not all placement in the shackles is the same. Sometimes birds miss this blade, and there's another person later on in the process, or shortly after the blade, I should say, called the backup killer, whose really only job is to sit there, knife in hand, and cut the throats of the birds who are missed by this automatic blade. So for most birds, that is where their story ends, right? It's likely that Beth's story would have ended there. But for other birds, what happens next in the process is that they go through a sort of scalding water bath, right? So ideally, because their throats were already cut, these birds will enter the scalding water already bled out and completely dead. The scalding water bath is supposed to loosen up the feathers so they can be removed from the carcass easier. But for birds who maybe the cut wasn't done correctly, they missed the blade entirely, or the backup person didn't cut correctly, these birds may not have bled out correctly or quickly enough, and these birds could have still been alive by the time that they reach the scalding water bath. And when birds who still have too much blood and who still may be alive go into the scalding water bath, that's where you get this phenomenon called, which is sort of colloquially called red birds, where the carcass gets this sort of reddish tint to it, evidence that the bird did not bleed out enough and may have in fact still been alive while they entered these scalding tanks. Yeah, so I mean, that's pretty much the end of the road for at least like the living birds. I do want to talk a little bit about the remainder of the process, just because it involves the workers as well. So the side where the animals come in from and are slaughtered in, and next up in the process would probably be having their heads cut off, their feathers removed, being eviscerated, not necessarily in that order, and then the birds will be chilled and then enter what is called the cold side of the process. So the hot side would be the other side when the birds first come in and are still alive, up until chilling. So cold side, it takes place in refrigerated rooms, just so everyone knows. I mean, that's why it's called the cold side. And the only reason I'm talking about it is because a lot of workers work on the cold side, and a lot of them face the same sort of issues as workers on the hot side, where they'll have to work these same sort of incredibly high line speeds. They'll do the same sorts of repetitive motions all day, every day, which leads to a lot of repetitive motion injuries, stuff like carpal tunnel, things like back injuries. There's a lot of heavy machinery. There's a lot of knives. So people will get cut. And I think there's something like 2 amputations per week at slaughterhouses in the US. I think that's mostly due to people losing fingers. And obviously on the cold side, the rooms are refrigerated, which adds sort of extra stress to people's cardiovascular systems as well as their joints. So there's a lot of injuries that could happen there. I remember at one slaughterhouse I was at, the upper management would warn us about a condition called claw hand, where essentially your joints in your hand would just sort of freeze and refuse to move, or open and close, I should say. So you wouldn't be able to open or close your hand anymore, and you'd be stuck in this sort of claw shape. And that's because of the sort of injuries that you can get from these repetitive motions at slaughterhouses. So yeah, I just wanted to talk about the rest of that process to highlight the sorts of problems that this process could have, not just for the chickens, but for the people that are working. It's really a horrible system for everyone involved, really. And you can see that in the high turnover rate for the jobs that are present at slaughterhouses. But yeah, I mean, that's pretty much the end of the story that I wanted to tell, at least. If you want to know more about what we do, our investigations, if you want to actually, look at the footage for these chicken slaughter places, if you feel like a little too happy at some point and want to be a little sadder, you can go to our website, fanimaloutlook.org. All of our investigations are online. You can also see a lot of blog posts that we do talking about various victories, actually, if you want to feel happy again. Victories, any sort of animal rights related news. A lot of times we'll comment on stuff like that. And you can also write a thank you note to Undercover Investigators if you want to, send them a nice message, really thank them for the work that they do, because it's hard doing that sort of work. Some of the investigations I did were, half a year or something like that. They spend a lot of time trying to bring, the truth to the public about what these animals go through. So yeah, that's basically it. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you, Tracy, for having us here.
Thank you both so much for your presentations, and especially thank you so much for the work that you've done. It's that I think we talked about this actually when we were talking about even doing this, that we might talk a little bit about what the experience was like for you, because I think anybody who hasn't done it probably really can't imagine. I mean, I can try to imagine how conflicted and how hard, and there was a question about how you process the experience. I know that's like very personal, and so don't whatever you want to share, don't feel that you need to share anymore. But I guess I just want to preface that question by just saying that it's thanks to people like you that the world has any idea what's going on behind those windows, and like the only hope that anybody will pay attention or care is because of your personal sacrifice. And so just it's like so much gratitude and appreciation. Thank you. And then again, if there's if you want to comment at all on how you've processed it. I know you're both not doing investigations anymore.
Scott, did you want to go first?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, sure, I can. There are a few things I think that helped me while I was in the field. One, I definitely tried to pay special attention to sort of my mental health while I was out there. One thing that really helped me was writing in a journal. I think it was a good way to sort of like vent my frustrations at everything that I could see happening around me in a space that was safe and no one could see anything about it. So I would do that basically like every day, just to sort of vent in that way. And while I was, I guess, on the job, like on the kill floor or wherever I was, the few things that helped me through those specific times, one would be, honestly, one is just kind of being afraid of being caught, of failing an investigation, right? And whatever desire you have to sort of like step in and save all of these animals, there's also that sort of competing desire to want to succeed at this investigation. And if anything happens, if anything shows on your face that people think you sound weird or anything like that, you've basically just wasted a ton of people's money, right? You don't get the footage that you want, and now you have to do all this process over again of getting a job and doing this work. And it's that sort of fear of failure that I think kept me sort of in line. And I think the other thing was just focusing on doing the work. There's a lot of things to focus on, one of which is just doing your job fast enough, especially at slaughterhouses. And the other thing is just trying to keep your mind on getting the right shots, right? Getting the right information. And if you can sort of keep your mind on the job, I think it gets you away from feeling it too much on an emotional level.
Yeah, and to just add to what Scott said and to address one of the questions in the chat, which I was very much interested in answering, is that, you know, a lot of people process trauma in different ways, and not everyone is going to have the same experience with how they process things, especially when you're an undercover investigator, when so much rides on you being able to blend in, being able to just, I guess for me, the way that I describe it is just putting up this wall. And I established that wall and built it up from scratch during my first investigation. And even that was hard, because you make friends when you're at these facilities, and you're the only one there who cares about these animals. And it's really hard to feel as though you're there, but also having to be detached from them, but feeling so much for them, and them recognizing that no matter what species they were, whether they were chickens or cows or fish even, I could feel some sort of connection with them. And I think no one really understands that more than an undercover investigator who's there with the animals in solidarity with them. And knowing that, as Scott said, you have this bigger picture in place, that you're there. The way that I've described it before is that you're there to document the animals, and whatever footage you get, that serves as their epitaph. That's the memory that they're leaving behind, because the animals you're documenting, they're already in the system. And unfortunately, that's the life that, you know, is thrust upon them, that they, you know, essentially have no hope of escaping unless there's just, you know, an incident or a situation where an animal can advocate for their own freedom and actually break out of these facilities themselves. And that's always an amazing, you know, miracle that can take place for certain animals who are able to do that, but a lot of these animals can't. So just understanding that and all of that put together, you know, eventually throughout investigation after investigation, there are some cracks that develop in that wall that you build up as an undercover investigator. And it depends, you know, certain people handle it in different ways. For me, after I retired was when it all hit me, and I felt all this guilt for leaving the animals behind. And that's something that, you know, you sort through. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who had to do that. But essentially, when it comes to mental health, that's something, as someone who is heavily involved in investigations now at Animal Outlook, that's something I really stress with our investigators, is that making sure that they're able to take care of their mental health, to know that that's very important, because if you're not at your 100% best and healthiest, then your investigations have a potential of being compromised, right? You can't, you know, have tears running down your face as you're working your job, because that's, you know, that's putting the animals in jeopardy, is putting your investigation in jeopardy. So mental health, and also just in terms of just taking care of yourself. As advocates, we feel so much and we connect so deeply with these animals, and it's hard to understand. There's this Star Wars quote that I'm remembering now, where it goes something along the lines of, you want to feel as much as you can and have that empathy with those who you want to help, but you have to understand that you can't take it all on yourself, because it's going to hurt you. And that's, you know, a symptom of compassion fatigue too. So ultimately, to sum it up, it's something I'm very much interested in, is making sure that our investigators get the help that they need to be able to process these things, and that they are okay with processing it in their own way, and us understanding that. And then also, I've had a really big interest in what happens to our investigators after they leave the field. So that was what motivated me to start the Former Investigator Support Group. And that's something that I've been trying to reach out to other former investigators to participate in, so that we can, you know, share our grief and share our experiences with those of us who know what we've been through and who understand, who are on the same page. So that's also something that I've been interested in developing further, but that's something that's also on the table as well. to help out our investigators, because it's a hard job, but somebody's got to do it. And it so happened that I was one of those people, and so was Scott.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, yeah, I think that anybody who hasn't done it can't understand what you've been through. And then, like you say, everybody processes everything differently. But obviously, yeah, it just takes a lot of courage and bravery and personal sacrifice to be able to do it. You're I think we all agree, you're just heroes. So thank you for everything, and thank you for talking a little bit about your own personal process. And then Laura commented, that in the chat box, if you've seen, as much as the investigators need therapy, also, and you touched on this, I know Scott, actually we both touched on this. I mean, what are the workers going through? And I know I've read studies that slaughterhouse workers have an incredible high rate of PTSD, and like high rates of domestic violence and alcoholism. And yeah, I mean, do you want to say anything about, I guess, just, it's a marginalized group to begin with, right? Who's likely to be working in those environments. And then what do they have to do to be able, what do they have to do to their own psychology and emotional state to be able to do that job? Sorry, there's also roosters now crowing in the background here.
Sorry, yeah. No, I've definitely heard that about slaughterhouse workers, and yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine what it's like for them. I mean, obviously, I have worked in on the kill floors in slaughterhouses, but for me, I mean, even though it's a long time for an investigation, right? I would say that a lot of them take months. Right, these people could be at these jobs for years, so it's really hard to sort of gauge what sorts of things that they have gone through. I know that this issue of maybe desensitization is something that has come up when I myself have talked to people, to therapists. I mean, on a personal level, I was kind of worried that I had maybe gone too far in being desensitized to these things, because right, you see other people in the movement, right, and they'll say things like, oh, I can't watch this sort of footage, right, it's too much for me, right, it hurts. And for me, being in the field, it did feel like something that I eventually kind of got used to, right? A lot of the stress later on came not from being witness to all these horrible things, but just the stress of trying to remain undercover. So I did think that maybe I had become too desensitized, but what I was told, I don't know if this is too private or not, but basically, I was told that it was something that I had to get used to protect myself, essentially. And that's sort of what I think ends up happening with a lot of these workers. And yeah, it could end up detrimental to their personal lives, to go too far in that and become much too guarded. And yeah, I would definitely sort of urge anyone who's been in that sort of situations to talk things through with a professional or with other people. I certainly don't blame a lot of the workers who end up in those jobs, because yeah, they are basically everyone that I worked with in live hang was an immigrant, right? They're people that don't have the opportunity to get a lot of other jobs. A lot of them don't speak a lot of English, right? Some of them have been in prison, right? This is the only chance that they have to make money. So a lot of those people, right, are really just victims of circumstance. And yeah, I really do hope that they get the help that they need.
Yeah, for me, it was a really eye-opening experience to work alongside people who I shared a lot of experiences with in my personal life, and a lot of the same culture as someone who is half Hispanic and as a person of color, and just understanding that struggle to make enough money to feed your kids or make enough money to pay your rent. And not knowing, if there's any other opportunity out there, but knowing that there is one, and you just take it. And I feel as though a lot of these workers, they're taken advantage of because of that desperation that is prevalent in lower income communities, where a lot of these animal agriculture facilities will be set up. And that's just, a whole other thing with environmental, issues that can come up from animal agriculture. So it's just a system that has a lot of threads, and there's just an interconnectedness in oppression and suffering with just the animal agriculture system. But it was really eye-opening for me to work alongside these workers and understand, the sort of gymnastics that they would have to go through, like mental gymnastics, to try to justify the way that they treated these animals, because they're with these animals every single day for long hours, 10 hours, 14 hours. So it's inevitable that they begin to see these animals as sentient beings. It's hard to deny unless you completely cut off that connection that you can form. But it's interesting what the experience that the way that I can sum it up is with the experience that I had at one of my investigations at a salmon hatchery, my Cook Aquaculture investigation in Maine, where these workers were working with fish, and fish don't vocalize their pain. You can see it's apparent that they're in pain and they suffer, but they don't vocalize. So one would think that it's easier for people to justify fish being mistreated if they're already in that mindset of fish not being on the same level as other land animals. So I was fully expecting the workers there to have that same mentality, but it was interesting that there was one occasion where there were small baby fish who were in a tank, and the worker who was removing the dead bodies of the baby fish from that tank and accidentally hitting the live baby fish was actually apologizing to the baby fish. And he was telling them he was sorry. And the workers at that facility were expressing remorse for causing harm to fish, even though, they don't vocalize, you don't hear them scream. And they exist in one place that we can't get to naturally, right? We can't go underwater and breathe underwater and have these interactions with them the same way we would have with cows or with chickens. And yet they still developed some sort of connection with them because they saw them every day. So it's interesting that the animal agriculture industry encourages this sort of detachment, and it's such a contradiction to the way that human beings and animals naturally interact, because you spend enough time with these animals, you definitely understand them a lot more than most people would, especially these workers. So they're influenced by the system that encourages them to treat these animals as products, and they have to buy into that mentality in order to stay working at these facilities. Because if you understand that animals are sentient and that they experience pain, and whatever you do to them and the system that they're trapped in and that they're filtered through is harmful to them, there's no way that you could work at those facilities and be sane. So it's a way of sort of like that detachment that Scott was mentioning, just protecting yourself and buying into that notion that animals aren't sentient, that they're just products on a product line, which is completely untrue.
And I think, like, you mentioned, these are also people who, they probably don't have an alternative. Like they need that job. And it seems to me too that, yeah, in order, just like you're saying, in order to do that job, you would need to cut yourself off and tell yourself that they are not sentient. I feel like there were probably a few, I don't know, but my guess is that there are probably some true like sadistic people who go to work at a slaughterhouse. But my guess is that most people are like normal people with very few choices. They go work at a slaughterhouse and they then become what they become because they have shut their hearts off and flipped a switch that says these are not sentient beings, even though somewhere within them, they still know that they are. But like you said, in order to do that job, you have to flip that switch, at least if you're doing it, for any reason other than an undercover investigation for a short period of time. And I think, what you said about just, it's like that system. I mean, how can you, it's that thing. It's like, it's so mind blowing that this is a system that even exists. How can it, just seeing what we've just seen, how is it possible that that system exists? And, I think that's so much of why most people just, they don't want to look, because they don't want to know. Because how could you participate in it? So I guess a few kind of related questions though, like, just, all of the practices are, through the whole process are so egregious and so cruel and obviously cause so much suffering. I'm curious, I guess, about what's legal and what's not legal. Like what practices are there practices that are, I'm sure that there are some practices that are very common, but they're not legal, but they're still very common in the industry. But like how much of, I guess, what you saw that caused excruciating pain is actually just a legal part of the process. And that's kind of like a big question. If either one of you wants to.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the question of what's legal is interesting, and one of, I think, the most disturbing maybe sort of facts about the legality of things that happen on factory farms, right? And it's this question of like standard practice exemptions, where a lot of these processes, like you mentioned, are basically everywhere, right? They happen on, maybe like 80-90% of the farms. And because of the way that these laws are set up, those practices essentially just become legal, even if they, cause this egregious pain, because the industry uses them, because most farms use them. So you have things like, dehorning that Erin has documented for us, right, where people are essentially burning the horn tissue off of baby cows, and they're doing it, without any sort of anesthetic, or right, the castration of piglets without anesthetic, right, things like that. Those are practices that happen pretty much everywhere on all of these pig and cow farms. But because it happens everywhere, the industry has basically been able to like police itself and I guess determine what is or is not legal. So to get these sorts of actions prosecuted, to get results, like charges filed, it sort of takes something above and beyond what happens in these standard practices, right? So our Tyson investigation, one of our Tyson investigations, I think that was before Erin's Tyson investigation, but we talked about it still. It was the one with nose boning. We had, I think, 9 people who I think were convicted on like 20 something counts of animal cruelty for that investigation. And it did have to do a lot of those counts with nose boning. But the people were basically like going above and beyond, being cruel to these animals, right? Like holding them roughly, of course, like we're not using any anesthetic, right? Grabbing them by their heads, necks, wings, things like that. So for something to, I guess, go beyond a standard practice that is legally allowed, you kind of have to, it has to be something that either isn't part of any other standard practice, right? So like, hitting an animal like with your fist or whatever, right? Like that's not going to be covered under any sort of standard practice exemption. But for something that is related to a standard practice, you really have to go above and beyond on the cruelty to be convicted of something like that.
So that's interesting though too, because it seems to me like things like hitting animals or throwing animals. I mean, I remember seeing videos of that 15 years ago. And I feel like I see that in almost every undercover video I've ever seen, is that kind of abuse. And so while it clearly, while it may be illegal, it's clearly very common, which then brings up the whole ag-gag laws. And I think in your bio, it says like in one of your investigations, they were just in the midst of passing ag-gag legislation in the state. Is that right?
Yeah, for my Mount Terror investigation, the chicken slaughterhouse one, I think right after the investigation was complete and we released the investigation, that's when the ag-gag law passed. I think that we were able to drum up like a lot of public support through the investigation and getting it, you know, in local TV and in local news stories and stuff like that, where I'm not going to say that it's like completely because of us, but you know, the governor of the state didn't feel, I don't know, for whatever reason, comfortable with it. He ended up vetoing the ag-gag law. And then I think he in turn was sort of like overruled by state legislature. So it ended up going onto the books anyway, unfortunately. That was in North Carolina, by the way, but yeah. So that was an unfortunate thing, but you know, we tried with that investigation to really get a lot of people's eyes on it. And I mean, you know, sometimes it's not about what the actual public wants, right? I mean, when polls have been done, people are, the majority of them are not in favor of ag-gag, right? They want to know what happens to these animals. They want to be able to see inside the process of, you know, food for them, I guess, creation. And yeah, I mean, we're unlucky with North Carolina, but I think the work that a lot of groups are doing now to get a lot of these ag-gag laws overturned on First Amendment rights has also been very fruitful, right? And we've been able to knock a lot of these laws off the books, which, you know, helps us do our investigations in turn, right? Because then we don't have to fear that we're going to be suffering all these penalties when we do them.
So you do feel like, though, do you think generally it's those laws are pretty much destined to like fail their constitutional challenges and like go away, you think?
I think if the reasoning of the courts works how I think it will, I think yeah, I mean, it should be pretty clear on First Amendment grounds that that whistleblowers should be protected. But I also think it's not going to stop states from enacting new ag laws. So it might just be, you know, a sort of situation where we go around and around with states enacting new laws that we then have to combat.
That was sort of my next question, was like, yeah, do you at this point do you just not, maybe this is like getting too much into the details, like this is undercover work, so maybe I don't want to ask you about the specifics of your undercover work, but do you know at this point how many states actually have ag-gag laws on the books?
Ooh, not off the top of my head. It's really just a handful.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay.
4 to 5. It can't be that many. I'm pretty sure there's someone on this call who can answer that.
I think Alabama does have an ag-gag. Like, we're in Alabama. I think we do have an ag-gag law on the books. I'm just looking. It looks like maybe somebody has their hand up. Although, Katrina. It looks like Katrina has. Katrina, I'm sorry. I don't know how long your hand has been up. Did you have a question? You want to type it in the chat box, or were you just saying hi? I don't know. Let's see. I think maybe, I don't know, Katrina's hand is up, so let's see if Katrina has a question. Otherwise, I'll just keep asking you my questions.
Yeah, and there's also a question that Hope asked that I saw in the chat as far as what some of the wins are that have come from our investigations, and as far as criminal charges or product/process changes. I think for me, the wins have been few and far in between. But for my first investigation, the farm that I investigated actually got shut down. Unfortunately, the chickens were just taken from that facility by Tyson. So obviously they were still in the system, unfortunately. But the owner of the facility was actually charged to not work with animals for at least 1 year, if I'm not mistaken. So, you know, that's about, sometimes that's the best that we can hope for. And for my other investigations, those facilities are still operating, unfortunately, but we are still, our legal team is doing tremendous work in just continuously putting the pressure on and continuously fighting for these animals who are still trapped there long after my investigations have been over. I think Scott has a couple of victories that he can address from his investigations as well.
Yeah, I mean, not necessarily for my investigations. I do have one, not necessarily like criminal charges, but for my last investigation into Superior Farms, which is a lamb slaughterhouse. And basically what we saw there, one of the things we saw was a lot of like lambs moving seemingly in response to having like their tails cut after the slaughter process. So basically what happened is the slaughterhouse ended up having to sign an agreement with the DOJ, and then they ended up having to change some of their processes and hiring additional workers to oversee what happens to the lambs during the slaughter process. So we were able to get a victory there where we really changed how the slaughterhouse now operates. And then I talked about the charges from Tyson. I think one of our dairy investigations, Mason Dixon, I believe, also had at least one person plead guilty to animal cruelty charges. After that, but it really is sort of like few and far between for victories like that that are really like charges, because I mean a lot of the local law enforcement, right, where we go to after investigations, I mean they're pretty friendly towards the animal agriculture community in the state, right? It could be a big part of their culture, of the jobs in the state. So it can be very hard to get them to actually prosecute a lot of these people. But a lot of what we do isn't necessarily, for that purpose. For a lot of investigations, we're happy just with a lot of like media coverage, right? A big part of what we do is just try to get the public to realize what is happening, try to get our information that we've documented out into that public space where people can view it and people can learn the truth about how these industries operate. So I think there's a lot of ways to sort of define victories, if I can say that. But yeah, sometimes we are lucky and we get legal victories like that.
I was going to ask one more follow-up question on that, and then just to we're just a few minutes away from needing to end. So if anybody else has any questions, I'm going to sneak my last question in before anybody else. But you can again type it in the Q&A box or type it in the chat box. But just on that point about it's success if you can get a lot of media attention. Like how helpful is, or how open would you say generally the media is to sharing what you find in your investigations?
This kind of depends, I think. Sometimes there are a lot of things happening in the news, and it makes it very hard for us to sort of get stories out, right? I'm sure people can think of in recent memory some events that may be going on still that sort of dominate the news cycle and make it hard to get media attention on. And it also sort of depends on the content that we have, right? If there are a lot of like real flashy scenes of people being extraordinarily cruel, doing things like hitting animals, things like that, that helps us get coverage because it's shocking footage. Even though footage of standard practices are no less important, probably more important, right? Because those things happen right, or they're sanctioned by the industry, right? Those don't get as much traction because the industry can be like, oh yeah, that always happens. That's how these processes work, stuff like that. It also depends on the species sometimes that we investigate. This is what we were talking about before, right? Where a lot of people will feel more empathy for larger animals, right? Pigs, cows, sheep, animals like that, and sort of less for chickens or fish or other animals. I'm pretty sure my chicken investigation got the least press out of all of them, unfortunately. But yeah, that's just sort of the way it works.
Yeah, and we at Animal Outlook, and I'm sure every other AR organization as well, try very hard to get those stories into mainstream media. I think that that's something that's pretty important aside from the legal victories. And shout out to our communications department for the awesome work that they do with, trying to get those stories as animal stories into major news outlets and things like that. And then also social media is a really helpful tool. And that's been how a lot of people have been getting a lot of the information that they do manage to get through their phones and just scrolling through Instagram or TikTok or Twitter or social media apps like that. And they'll be informed about things that they didn't really realize before when it comes to animal agriculture and the practices that are ingrained within that system. And I just think that, there are a lot of ways that we can create impact, and there are ways that I've seen that impact just seep into just my personal life, my everyday life when I interact with people. You wouldn't believe how many people don't think that cows have to be pregnant to produce milk, and they have to have a baby and then have the baby be taken away in order for them to produce milk for human consumption, that's taken for human consumption. And I remember having a conversation with my cousin who watched, for some reason, he's not vegan or vegetarian or anything like that. And he just happened to mention how he saw a video online of a cow being killed with a bolt gun to the head. And he just said that looked wrong. That's not the way that they're supposed to do it, right? And little did he know, I had to tell him that that's standard practice, and it happens, every second. Right now, where I'm talking, that's happening on a daily basis in slaughterhouses. And he didn't realize that until when he saw the footage, and he had that visceral reaction. That's a standard practice that's put in place and set in place in practice throughout the animal agriculture industry, and yet he had never been exposed to it until he stumbled upon that video. And then it opened his eyes to realize, wow, that does look wrong. That's a standard practice. That's insane. So, and that just opens the doors to us being able to have those interactions with people, and then clear the air and inform them of these things that are going on that they otherwise would not have been exposed to if it wasn't in newspapers or if it wasn't on TV. They can still, there's always a way to allow people to have access to know what exactly is going on with what they choose to have on their plate, and to inform them that there are better alternatives out there for them.
And that's also like why we all need to be sharing on social media, right? Your videos. And it's also, though, I think it helps us, as activists, to know that like we can help by sharing your videos, by sharing the Undercover Investigations, et cetera, like that we can be a part of helping push that change. So that's also like, that's encouraging, I think. It's that thing, I think so many activists, at least I feel this all the time. And so I kind of assume other activists feel the same way, but it's, there's this massive system. We all want it to disappear tomorrow, and we're all individuals, and it can be overwhelming. But it's like, I feel like we always come back to that, we all have a contribution to make, and no one single person is going to end this industry, but like together collectively, we can. And just even, you're doing this amazing work, and that we can all, help support the work you're doing by sharing, and that really matters. That's good to hear. So I think with that, if you have any, if there's anything else that you want to say before we go, we are coming up right on, everybody's in a different time zone, but it's like the end of the time officially. So I just want to say thank you, so much again for all of your work and for taking the time today to share with us, everything a piece of what you've seen. It's so powerful, and I wish everybody would see the investigations that you're doing, because it's so clear what's right and what's wrong. So yeah, any last words before we go?
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you. And to everyone else, feel free to visit our website if you have other questions that we didn't get to here. I think you can contact us through the website, and we'll get back to you on.
So animaloutlook.org.
Yep. Okay,
great. Well, thank you again. Thank you everybody for participating. Thank you for your great questions. Just hope you're both, Scott and Erin, seeing the comments in the chat box, just thanking you again so much for your difficult work and for sharing today. So thank you everyone, and hopefully we'll see everybody in October for Karen Davis's talk also on the chicken industry. Okay, take care everybody. Bye.